Yeah, good evening, Mayor, members of the City Council. I'm Josh Chadwick, your Benicia Fire Chief. And as you mentioned tonight, I've been asked to provide a brief presentation on the fire department's response to recent fire that we had at the Benicia Port Terminal facility. So next slide, please. The fire occurred last month on April 9th at 12:20 in the afternoon. It originally came in as a structure fire at 1279 Bayshore Road, and we responded with the first alarm assignment. That assignment includes Engine 11, Engine 12, Truck 11, and Battalion 11, all from Benicia, plus one engine from Vallejo. And I'll just let you know, during these first handful of slides, I've included some audio files, mostly of dispatch communications, and hopefully they play well and work in the chamber with all our new audio videos. So if we go ahead and play that first audio.
Station 11, Station 12, Battalion 11, respond for a structure fire, 1279 Bayshore Road, 1279 Bayshore Road. We're advised structure is on fire.
All right. So I thought there was more to that file. Anyways, that sounded all right, so we'll keep going. So while we were responding, dispatch updated us that it was actually the petroleum coke silos that were on fire. At this point, Battalion 11, who was still en route, saw a fairly large column of smoke coming up, and he requested an additional truck company from Vallejo. And if we can go ahead and play that second file.
Finish Engine 11 and Truck 11 responding.
Copy, truck and engine responding, 1239 Bayshore Road. It's going to be for a silo that's on fire.
Benicia Fire, I'll go ahead and take another truck from Vallejo. I have a good column of smoke.
Copy, another truck from Vallejo.
So that all occurred relatively quickly. All Benicia units were on scene at 12:25, so within 5 minutes of the initial dispatch, which was actually pretty impressive. And they immediately went to work. So next slide, please. When Battalion 11 arrived on scene, he reported a working fire at the base of the silos. He stated it was running up the conveyor belt toward a ship that was moored at the dock. At that point, he established Bayshore Command and gave objectives and assignments to the incoming resources and switched everyone over to a tactical channel. We can go ahead and play that first clip.
Battalion 11, Benicia Fire.
Go ahead.
Just be advised, we have V-Fire 22, and I contacted Vallejo. They said it's a petroleum coke that's in the silo.
Yeah, I'm coming on scene now. I'm on the dock. I got a working fire off the coke silo going up the belt system to the boat. I'll go ahead and take Bayshore Command.
Copy, a working fire off the coke silo up the boat and Bayshore Command.
Crews, I'm going to have you guys come on into the dock. Our goal is going to be working to the coke silo. That'll be right after you guys get off the bridge.
11 copies. We're turning in now. We'll be your first engine.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and switch over to 22.
Copy. We'll be switching to V-Fire 22. Truck copies. We're engaged now. Engine 12 on scene. We're switching to V-Fire 22.
Copy, truck and engine 12 on scene and V-Fire 22.
So that was just the radio traffic of the first, battalion and the first units arriving on scene, kind of describing what they had. We're familiar with what the coke is, but possibly a lot of the public isn't. And what it is it's a byproduct of the refining process at the Vallejo refinery. Crude oil is brought in by ship, sent up through pipelines to the refinery, and through that process, it it creates a product that's essentially like a fine dust, a powdery dust, and it does catch fire. And so they have to do something with that. So they bring it down, usually by rail, to those silos. That picture shows one of there's 4 of them. They're all sort of attached and they're relatively large. And from there, it's stored until it gets put on through this hopper system where it's like a conveyor belt up to a system that puts it onto ships. And then those ships send it out overseas and do whatever they do with it. They make steel with it in China or something along those lines. So that's what we were dealing with originally. And that just gives a little bit of background. So at this point, Battalion 11 really recognizes that there's a potential for some good growth on this fire, and he goes and requests a second alarm. Did we already play that second clip yet? Let's go ahead and play the second clip.
Benicia Fire Command.
Go ahead.
It's gonna take us a little bit of time to access in here, but I do have the coke silo, like an outbuilding that is on fire, and it's running up the conveyor belt. I'm gonna go ahead and request a second alarm. You don't need to give me an additional truck. I'll keep 21 coming.
Copy. Agree to do a second alarm.
So timing of all that happened at 12:28. So now we're just 3 minutes after arrival. He's requesting the second alarm, and that includes 3 additional engines, 1 additional truck, which was already requested, and 1 additional chief officer. The next slide, please. So regardless really of what the incident type is, it could be a grass fire or a house fire or this type of fire, really our overall priorities remain the same. It's always life safety first, and that includes any civilians as well as the responders. Next, we want to stabilize the incident, and that will in turn really address property conservation and limit environmental impacts. So on this incident, we quickly recognized that there were also some other non-fire responders that were going to be necessary to assist with both the life safety as well as the environmental impacts. And that, again, was realized and dealt with relatively quickly. If you want to go ahead and play that.
Benicia Fire Command. I'm also going to need Fish and Game, Coast Guard representatives to the command post.
Battalion 11, can you repeat your traffic? I was landline.
Coast Guard, Fish and Game to the command post, please.
Copy. Coast Guard and Fish and Game.
And that request was made at, again, 8 minutes from arrival. Next slide, please. So once the incident priorities are identified, objectives are created to meet those priorities. And the 3 initial objectives were: 1, we wanted to prevent the fire to spread up into those coke silos. 2, we wanted to prevent the fire from spreading into the hopper system. It was already up the conveyor belt, but there's like about a 4-story system that it uses at the top of that. We wanted to keep the fire out of that. And then finally, to keep the fire from getting to the pier and the ships. The photo on this slide is an aerial view of the scene. You can see if you could see the white circle, that's where the silos are. The little red right below it is where the fire was, burning up the conveyor system. And then I also put the 3 ships that happened to be moored. All 3 of them were moored at the time that the fire started. Next slide. So with the 3 objectives established, strategies are implemented to meet those objectives. So the first, I see created a silo division, and that was established with the assignment of keeping the fire from getting into those silos. A dock division was established with the assignment of keeping the fire from extending into the hopper system and into the pier. And then third, the commanding officer ordered the expedited basically movement, get those ships off the dock, whether it's getting, at a minimum, get them out into the water off a way so that they didn't become a exposure problem. So once these divisions were established, really it becomes the division supervisor's job to use whatever resources are assigned to them to meet those objectives. Next slide. So as you can imagine, the incident included some real non-routine challenges for us. Some of these include limited water supply. So the water down in that area, it's an older system and it doesn't have a really robust water supply system. And we had some significant apparatus access and just space issues. Part of that has to do with where the dock is. There's one single, well, 2-lane with a divider that is the only way to enter onto the dock. And then once you're on it, there's all kinds of equipment and buildings and other, things that are blocking fire apparatus access. The other issue, and the reason I put this slide in, is we had to lay in quite a bit of the supply hose, and that's what's shown in that picture is 5-inch, we call it large diameter hose, and once that's on the ground, it really doesn't get moved, and you can't drive over it. So if you're laying from a hydrant all the way out to the pier, it really limits our access. So in short order, we couldn't get many more engines down in that area. We also had some windy conditions. The wind was not helpful in the beginning because, again, one of those priorities was keeping the fire off the pier. The wind was blowing from the west to the east, which means it was blowing from where the fire started towards the pier, and that was bad. Later, it turned out to be quite a blessing because once the pier was burning, the wind was blowing the smoke out to the water and away from the community, which turned out to be a much more important blessing for us. Another issue is the lag time of relocating those ships. Those aren't like, ski boats tied up to a dock. It takes a tremendous amount of time and effort and personnel to get those things moved. It takes coordination with Coast Guard and pilots and tugboats and longshoremen on the docks, and it was surprising to me how long that process takes, but that definitely took some time. And we also had issues where we're working over water. You have firefighters in structural firefighting gear that doesn't do well for swimming, so you have to be really careful that they're not, going over the edge, and we don't have personal protection, flotation and structure gear at the same time. It's kind of a one or the other, so that's a concern. And then another one was the hopper system. It's a electrically powered piece of equipment, and water onto electricity doesn't always turn out good, so we had to do quite a bit of confirmation that the hopper was, shut down, locked out, tagged out. So those are just some of the issues that we were dealing with at the time. Next slide, please. So I haven't mentioned it yet, but Division Chief Todd Matthews was the battalion chief on day, and he was the one who assumed command. He was the one who heard most of that radio traffic with dispatch. I happened to be in Hayward at the time the fire started, and Todd called me just after, a little bit after it started, and kind of gave me a heads up on what we had. I monitored the radio traffic for a little while, and I decided to call Mario Giuliani here to my left, who was the acting city manager at the time, and I just let him know, hey, we got this going on. It has the potential to get big, just letting you know. Maybe about 15, 20 minutes later, Todd called me back, and just from the tone in his voice and what I was hearing, I told him I'm heading back to the city. So started heading back from Hayward, still listening to the radio, making phone calls. I called Mario back. I told him that at a very minimum, we're going to need to activate our city communications team, which just did amazing in this incident. And it's, again, such a blessing having them now compared to prior to their activation or ability to activate them, and that was huge. I knew we were going to get a lot of calls from the press and need to communicate with our community. So he started that process of activating them, and I also gave him a heads up that there's going to be a high likelihood that we may need to do at least a partial EOC activation. So that was kind of going on for a while. Next slide. So in an earlier slide, I mentioned our 3 primary objectives were to prevent the spread to the petroleum coke silos, and that was accomplished. We wanted to prevent the hopper system and the moored ships from catching fire, and that was accomplished. Unfortunately, the third one of preventing it to the combustible areas of the pier was not, and at about 1:01 p.m., it became well established in the pier, and I'll talk real quick about what that pier is. It's an old pier. It's made of very huge, very large timbers that are soaked in creosote, which is a preservative that helps them not rot when they're in the water and in the mud, but it also is a flammable product. And it's just a crisscross maze of that underneath. And then on top is just layers and layers and layers of blacktop roadway. So it's in some areas it was 12 inches thick of blacktop on top of that. So that underside where the timbers were got going pretty good at that point. Next slide. So throughout this presentation, I have almost every slide is a picture from this fire on April 9th, but this one picture happens to be taken about 20 years earlier at the exact same location. It was on September 4th of 2001. And I remember this fire very well. I was a newly appointed acting driver operator on one of the engines that was the first to arrive on scene. I remember it being incredibly chaotic. I felt like we were behind the 8 ball the entire time. It took days to extinguish, and a lot of lessons were learned. And the 2 biggest lessons I would say that were learned were that the only way to really access the fire to extinguish it is from the water side through fireboats. You can't get there, you can't get hoses to that area. You can't really get hoses to either side. There's water on both sides, but the boats can only get to one side. And just depending on the tide, the way the angle is of the water in the dock itself, that's the one way. And then the other way is basically breaking through those layers of blacktop roadway to get to the fire from the top. So luckily we learned from that and we implemented those tactics on this fire. Next slide. So again, once the fire became established on the pier, we did change our tactics. All the fire vehicles that were on the pier were directed to reposition to a safe distance. And again, based on that 2001 fire, we started requesting fireboats and requesting backhoes with jackhammers to help break up the roadway. I'll go ahead and play that audio clip on there.
British Fire Command, I'm going to go ahead and take this to a 3rd alarm. I'd like to go ahead and request a fireboat from Confire. And also Port Chicago, if we can get a hold of Port Chicago and see if their fireboat is in the dock, I'll need another fireboat.
You can go ahead and play the second clip also right now.
Go to command.
May just be advised that 3rd alarm, we handed you over to Solano SO. I contacted Conveyor for a boat. They said it's out of service due to mechanical issues, but Moscow has a boat and they copy cross traffic, so they're going to try to have them respond.
Copy. Let's go ahead and put a call into Oakland or San Francisco and see if either of their boats are willing to travel this distance. I should also have the ability to maybe get a boat out of Richmond would be another option.
Copy. Call contact Oakland, San Francisco, or Richmond to see if we can get another boat.
So at this point, hopefully you guys can see that picture on the slide. You could see while it was hitting that pier, those ships are still, all 3 of them are still moored to the dock. So that gives you some indication of how long that process took. You can also see just by looking at it what the smoke looked like. And this is the point where we were happy the direction of the wind. It wasn't super strong, but it was consistent through the entire incident, blowing from west to east, blowing this smoke out over the water. Next slide, please. So this is a screenshot of a text message I sent Todd. It kind of explains what was really on the forefront of my mind during the incident. I'm gonna go ahead and read it. I said, I'm thinking maybe I didn't emphasize this enough, but my biggest concern with this entire incident is the wind changing direction and blown back towards the city. Your biggest job now, or anyone who's monitoring out there's biggest job, is to immediately notice a wind change. And if that happens, I will need to immediately issue advisories, shelter-in-place orders, and/or evacuations for the lower industrial park. And I got a copy back. So that just kind of wanted to share with you my thought process at that point. This slide shows a photo from our emergency operations center, which we did end up activating that day. I could do a whole nother presentation on that alone. We've already debriefed it. I think it went really well. I'm super proud of the city staff that responded. Reminder, this was on a weekend and people were all over, and pretty much everyone that was called came to work. Some of the activities that happened at the EOC, we had Benicia Police dealing with road closures and preparing for possible shelters and evacuations. Public Works was there assisting with heavy equipment requests and preparing for long-term road closures. We had liaisons from Amports, Valero, United States Coast Guard, Fish and Wildlife, Solano OES, Bay Area Air Quality Management District, Solano Environmental Health. We had logistics staff, which was mostly city staff, that were dealing with all the requests from incident command, fuel and food, to name a couple. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we had the communications team in there dealing with press releases, preparing for notices for the community. So it was a busy room, and it was well utilized. And again, I'm just super proud of our city staff on that one. Next slide. This one might be a little hard to read, but this is just a incident command chart showing what fire units were assigned to each of those divisions. So you can see the silo division, dock division. We later established a Valero dock division, which is the third dock where the red ship was in that other one. The marine division, and then medical group. And on that marine division, you can see all those fireboats. They weren't there all at the same time. Some of them rotated in and had to leave and got swapped out with others. Next slide. So talking about the fireboats, we used a total of 8 boats. Again, they weren't all there at the same time. Contra Costa, Boat 85, Oakland, Tiburon, Redwood City, San Francisco, Southern Marin, the Motco, and North Bay Fire Protection District. A couple pictures of those boats that were assisting us. Next slide. We also had quite a few special resource requests, air unit for breathing air for the firefighters, a tractor with backhoe. That's that upper left picture. That's our city courtyard from Public Works assisting in cutting through the deck there. And we need a fuel tender, a Salvation Army for food, a Dutra rep, and a large crane. That's the crane that you see on the 2 pictures on the right, which actually came in on a large barge. And then they also brought another heavy excavator with a jackhammer. Next slide. So as you can imagine, the fire attracted press from pretty much almost every Bay Area news agency. Instead of trying to answer all the calls and questions one at a time, speaking with acting city manager Giuliani, we decided to do a press conference. We set it up and invited them all there so we could pretty much tell them what we had, what we knew, and what was going on one time. And then later that evening and throughout the next day, Mario and the communications team continued to communicate with the press and issue advisories to the community. Next slide. So as we transitioned into the night operations, the fireboats continued to work. They made really good progress on extinguishing pockets of fire all along the full length of the pier. Those are some pictures from that. Next slide. And while that was going on, there was also night operations on the dock side. Our crews were up there being just super aggressive. They were actually taking sledgehammers and bashing through the roadway until they got to the hole, and then they would stick a hose with a cellar nozzle, which is meant for like basement fires, down there and put out fire that the fireboats couldn't get to. And they did that most of the night. Next slide. So this slide just depicts a total number of fire resources. This obviously doesn't include all the city staff and other, public works and PD, but this is just fire resources. So it took up a little over 100 total on this incident. Next slide. So it was a little after 9 a.m. the next morning. We declared that it's contained, and then a few hours later at 12:24 it was placed under control. So 24 hours and 4 minutes from when our initial dispatch till it was under control. That's a picture of Division Chief Matthews there with the crane on the barge in the background the next morning. Next slide. So early on in this fire, the incident commander requested a response from the Solano County Fire Investigation Unit. They arrived on the 9th, started their investigation. They ended up running out of daylight. They continued on the 10th, spent most of the day down there. And it's important to note that their job is really just to investigate whether the fire is criminal or intentionally set versus accidental. And at the conclusion of their investigation, they reported that it did not appear to be intentionally set, and that it was likely a mechanical issue on the lower end of the conveyor belt. And that's a picture of that the next morning. Kind of see it's hard to really see what those are, but those are like a sort of U-shaped rollers that these rubber mats roll up in that conveyor belt, and they roll that powder up to the hopper where it gets loaded into the ship. Next slide. That really concludes the presentation on the fire. What I really didn't discuss was all the actions that have taken place with the city since then. again, Mario's kind of leading the team, and it started the day of the fire, but there's been an effort to really bring the operations back to service. You know, there's a huge financial impact to the businesses down there, and it's the right thing for the city to help themselves to get back in service. And so we've been working with all the regulatory agencies and having even more than just weekly meetings, I think a couple times a week, working with them to safely and appropriately get that port back in service. And amazingly, one of the operations down there is the Amport's using it for the vehicles offloading, and that was back within a few days, and they got that back up and running and cleared through Coast Guard and again all the regulatory agencies. They were able to start bringing in the crude ships relatively quickly, and the only thing left that they're still working on is the loading the coke, offloading the coke from the silos to ships, and they're working on that currently. With that, I have them available for any questions.
Thank you, Chief. Well, let me first kick this off by saying how impressed I think we all are with the response to what could have been a devastating incident. And congratulations to you and your department and the rest of the city staff who stepped in a quick response and got everything under control in 24 hours. I did have a couple questions. So the fire back in 2001, it was similar in that it burned the dock also?
Yeah, that one, my understanding is that was determined, it was started by campfire from some fishermen on the shoreline. It burned the vegetation underneath and then immediately caught the underside of the dock on fire.
So the dock and the pier had to be rebuilt at that time?
Yeah, so just the aerial view that was on there probably isn't good enough, but if you were to go on Google Earth, you could see a section that's about 80 yards, maybe about 20 yards south of where we stopped the fire was where that one started, and it burned about an 80-yard section of the pier, and that was rebuilt with concrete.
Oh, what? So that was my question, whether we would have rebuilt it with this wooden infrastructure. That was not part of the original fire 20 years ago.
Correct. What burned this time was not part of the original fire.
So when we're going to rebuild this time, and I realize it's not the city who's going to rebuild it, I guess it's either Valero or Amports or a combination of the two. Are we going to be able to insist that this be rebuilt with concrete so we don't have this issue in the future?
I don't know that I'm the right person to totally answer that, but I have been involved in some conversations where the word is it's going to be built appropriately into current code, not the code that was, in the 50s or when it was originally built. So I would suspect that whatever it's built with is going to be much more robust. I can tell you that the fire suppression system that's going to be put in there will be up to current code, not what it was back then, which will be quite a bit helpful.
And so since pet coke is flammable, is there going to be any discussion about changing the way that conveyor belt operates? Is it going to be covered? Is there going to be any kind of protective, and maybe you're not the right person to ask, but I think it's a question for the staff in general. Can we protect the conveyor belt so that this doesn't happen again by covering it, for example?
And Mary Young, if I could answer.
Yes, please.
So it is probably too early for us to address these issues, but I just want you to know and council to know that we were conscious of those and thoughtful of those, and we will go through a process, and we will absolutely be representing the best interests of the city through that process and ensuring that whatever work is done is to appropriate standard.
Because the other issue that is not necessarily connected to the fire, but is connected to the pet coke operation is a lawsuit that's going on now concerning the release of pet coke into the waters. And so if we could, have something that would protect that from happening in the future, I think it's to everybody's benefit. Okay, Councilmember Masinski.
Josh, one thing I didn't hear the mayor say that I'll just add on top of, in addition to, because I know he also means this as well, is saying thank you to all the other supporting agencies that responded to help support not only the Benicia Fire Department, but you know, the hundreds of people that were called upon on that Mother's Day weekend to, you know, make this happen and try to keep our community safe. So condolences to everybody for their time, and thank you so much to you and your team. One thing I did have a question is that I know it's probably a hard number, so please feel free to give it a wag, but, you know, if we had 100 people that were just Benicia Fire Department staff that were there, I mean, how many resources in total do you think were deployed to try to help? Is it a 500-person number? Is it?
Clarify are you asking fire resources or total?
Just people in total, because I know everybody from, you know, the Emergency Operations Center to all the other agencies that were involved. How many people did this incident consume?
Yeah, I don't know. I would say probably we're pushing 200, but I'm not sure exactly.
Okay. No, thank you very much. And then similarly, the access and the extension of kind of the big hose to allow to give some pressure to actually help fight the fire from the land side. Was that an infrastructure problem that was caused, or is just a lack of facilities to allow, or was that the planned approach? So, for example, is there a hydrant closer that we could have used that wasn't working, or do we already know that in the event that there's fires in that area, that's the approach that we have to kind of take?
There were some issues with some of the hydrants that were in the area. The flow wasn't adequate, and I think a lot of it has to do with just the area. I mean, we're used to when we fight fires or deal with anything with those hydrants down in Lower Industrial Park, it's just an old system. I mean, when we have leaks in them, Kyle can attest to, we have maps that show pipes where there aren't, and the pipes are where the maps show that there are. You know, it's a mess down there. It's just an old system that was built back in the, you know, going back to like Civil War days. So I think it's a combination of all of that.
Yeah, and so I appreciate, one, having the foresight as a department to have the tools on hand to make sure that you can be successful in those situations, understanding the constraints that you're under. And then two, making sure that we had the resources to, and having the connections not only within the regulatory community, but within the firefighting community around the Bay Area, to where knowing even just who has boats off the top of your head, so that that's not a hour-long exercise trying to figure it out, is, you know, makes all the difference. So kudos to you and your team, and appreciate everyone also on the administrative side and how they handled the situation.
Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Largaspada.
Thank you, Mayor. Just 2 comments and 2 questions. You know, first, I mean, just bravo. I think the team showed great courage. I think the response was remarkable. And I think it's also just another reminder for the community and the surrounding area that, you know, we have this small city, a small staff, but a mighty one. And, you know, they met this challenge face on, in this instance, with great success. So we are all grateful for that. I think it's also a reminder of why, as council members, you know, we invest in public safety. This is why we invest in public safety, both on the personnel side and on the equipment side. So thank you. My 2 questions are, the first, if the wind had shifted the other way, you know, briefly, you know, what do we have in place to protect the surrounding neighborhood? And then the second question, you may have alluded to it, might be a work in progress, but any lessons learned from this? Obviously, in comparison to the 2001 fire, you know, gold stars. But if there was anything learned from this event, I'd be interested in hearing more.
Yeah, so to the first question, the plan was that if the wind shifted, it's a huge area to try to evacuate. And you wouldn't really know until it happened, whether it be, you know, the lower industrial park, the northern industrial park, how far it would go. Would it go into this, you know, city downtown? So it's really hard to plan. But planning for the worst, it would have been extremely large-scale evacuation, something that we wouldn't want to pull the trigger on. Sure. With, you know, it wasn't just that we were watching the wind, but I was also watching the wind forecasts. So we would have had a little bit of hopefully a little bit of a forewarning if it was due to start changing. But the plan was essentially going to be to issue a shelter-in-place warning to either the whole city or the, you know, the east side of the city. and then potentially evacuate just that lower industrial park area, you know, where the artist area is, and those buildings down the very bottom, down there closest to the port. That would probably be the area that would have been evacuated. I was in communications with the police chief on that, and we had messages ready to go. Through that, we would have issued alert Solano messages. We would have done our non-emergency alerts. We would have done social media. I mean, even to the point of having police officers drive down the street with PA systems, whatever it would have taken at that time. But that was ultimately the plan.
Vice Mayor Campbell.
Okay, I'm going to steal a line from this from philosopher Lucius Seneca, one of my favorites. And that's luck is when preparation meets opportunity. You guys have been preparing and preparing and preparing for these things for years. You know, you looked at every scenario. I've watched you guys, and it's just been fantastic. You know, this is when you got your chance to see if all that would work, and it worked fabulously. You know, staff, you know, all the staff, and you guys in particular, you were ready for it, and you just didn't miss a step. It was just so fantastic to watch you guys, you know, do this. You just were ready for everything. You know, for me, that's the thing which seems to be being missed. You guys, you know, you were throwing a fastball and you were ready. You're just as ready as you could possibly be for this, and everything worked. I was just so proud of you guys. It was just great. You know, that's all I can say. And thank you. You know, that was a catastrophe that could have been a lot worse, and you handled it just as magnificently as anything I've ever seen. Thank you.
Appreciate the kind words.
Okay, Councilmember Sturbridge.
Thanks. Well, again, I think we're all in agreement that it was an awesome job. I was actually out of town when it happened and watched it all on CNN. That was pretty incredible to see our fire response. As Tom says, the whole team's response. And you look back, just a few years ago, we didn't even have a plan. We didn't have this thing and this ability to reach out to the community. We did it for the fire. We did it for the water pipe break. So our communication to our residents is really, really important, and it's been very successful this last two catastrophic incidents. I did appreciate in the presentation hearing, you know, I know Todd Matthews, and I could hear it in his voice as well, that it was very controlled but very concerning. And then kudos to our dispatcher who was on the call as well. Everyone seemed calm. If it were me, I'd be running around crazy. But that's why you guys are doing what you're doing, and I'm not. I think that we have come a long way in our emergency response, and a lot of that has to do with you, Chief Chadwick. So your leadership, and kudos to Mario, who took the reins while our city manager was gone. But it's good to know, right, that you left the place in good hands. So anyway, thank you very much.
If I could comment just briefly on that.
Please.
Yeah, so I do want to also point out that, you know, I think within this story, there is an important story with the communications team, and you know, that item came before council some time ago and was supported by council. You know, we bring these things forward, and at the time, you don't necessarily really see the importance of it, but here's a decision that you made to support that unit, and then the team, you know, through, you know, Brett finding the money for it and in the budget, and then Sarah Terhurst and Mario and Terry putting that team together, putting training together for that team. So we have this really large group now that are on call, someone's on call, ready to go, and how much it improves our ability to respond and communicate, which is always kind of where we get typically beat up in these emergency responses in that communication piece. But, you know, I think some credit to council for, you know, we bring these things to you routinely, and you can't, it's not always clear, but you trust us, you support us in that work, and so we appreciate that.
Thank you. One last question, Chief. The pictures of the fireboats spraying water, do they draw water directly from the strait, or are they using tanks that are on the boat already?
So they draw it directly from the straits. They have incredibly powerful pumps. That San Francisco boat was here for the longest amount of time, and they were just operating that pump continuously the whole time. Just anecdotally, they burned $30,000 worth of fuel running the boat for that incident.
And can our equipment, if there was a fire near the water, can our equipment use water out of the strait?
Not from a boat, but we can draft. We have hose that we could draft out of the strait.
Into a line that you could use to suppress
But
a fire?
not nearly the gallons per minute that the bigger boats can do.
Okay, thank you. Well, again, thanks to everybody who was involved in this effort, and thanks for the presentation.